Today's talk, Demystifying Science, Why Science Isn't Rocket Science. Without question, the most powerful form of authority, the most authoritative authority on knowledge is science. If you want to know something about the physical world, it's said to be scientific in nature. That's a bit of a circular definition, but there's this enterprise called science that human beings engage in. There are many different forms of science. Increasing our scientific literacy and understanding of the ideas behind science, knowing how science kind of works, more or less, will empower us to understand the science claims in our own lives that we experience daily. So how does science think? Why is science said to be reliable? What can we do with scientific theories that seem entirely opaque or grand or contradictory or uncomfortable? What do we do with those? What is the role or nature of inference to the best explanation? And how might we get better science theories about reality? I did my PhD in the philosophy of science and hermeneutics. Weird words, don't worry about it now. But in the philosophy of science, you learn that science isn't quite as intimidating as you might initially think. Yes, it can be very complicated. Yes, there are many versions of science. Yes, there are many debates about how to do science well. But as an introductory to scientific thinking, just let me say that it is attainable by the average person, you and I. We can understand scientific reasoning, and it will help us in our everyday lives. It helps us in a number of ways. First, it helps us understand or appreciate that science isn't perfect, and we can also begin to appreciate why, although it's not perfect, it's still one of the best tools that we have for accessing reality, to making sense of the world around us. So I hope you'll find that. Previously, I discussed this thing called the inference to the best explanation under my induction video. Inference to the best explanation. It's a fancy way of saying trying to answer why questions. Inference to the best explanation is the cornerstone of scientific thinking. It's a form of inductive reasoning, so it's not absolute, it's not perfect. It goes something like this. Something happened, we'll call it phenomena Q, something happened, whatever it might be. Evidence seems to supply us with reasoning why this happened, and this evidence we're going to call an explanation for why Q. Therefore, whatever this evidence is, if it works out and it explains Q, then it's probably true. All right. As simple as that. Something happens. I have evidence to suggest why it happened. It seems to explain it. Therefore, it's probably true. With that reasoning in hand, what happens when there are multiple explanations for why one thing happened or why one thing exists the way it does? What do you do when you have multiple theories, multiple explanations trying to make sense of the world? Well, today we're going to discuss a few of the ways, just a few, that we can begin to sort through competing theories, adequate from inadequate, and so on. Let's start with the idea of an explanation. An explanation is simply a claim or a statement as to why something is or how something is the case. How or why. Notice that in an explanation, there are certain things that are taken for granted. For example, if I was to say to you the lawnmower won't start because there's no gas, I'm offering you an explanation for something. Okay, but I'm taking something for granted. The lawnmower won't start. I'm not trying to prove that the lawnmower won't start. I'm simply taking it for granted, and then I try and find an answer for why it won't start. And in this case, it's because there's no gas. The explanation, because there's no gas, is the explanation. It's pretty straightforward. Now, there may be other reasons for it, because there's water in the gas, because there's no spark plug. So there could be many competing explanations as to why the lawnmower won't start. But the point to notice now is that it's not really an argument that I'm trying to convince you or prove to you that the lawnmower is broken or something. I'm just trying to figure out why it's broken. And that's quite a bit different. Here's another example. My son broke the window by throwing a baseball through it. All right. So what I'm taking for granted here is that my son actually broke the window. Maybe he's confessed it, or maybe he's standing there and he's looking guilty. And the explanation is because he threw a window through it. Now, it may be, through a window, threw a baseball through it. Now, it may be that he threw a rock through it. It may be that he threw a baseball bat through it. Who knows? So there would be competing things. But at this explanatory level, I'm taking for granted that, in fact, phenomena exists, and I'm just trying to find evidence, more and more evidence to explain why that thing exists. Basically, we're Sherlock Holmes in this inference to best explanation. Sherlock Holmes would go around and he would observe people's behavior, he would observe the scene, and he would collect evidence as much as he could to give an explanation for something. Was it 100%? No. Was it persuasive? Yes. In the interest of full disclosure, there are many different kinds of explanation. Here are 3 common ones. The first is teleological. A teleological explanation, and we actually get this term from Aristotle, teleology, for purpose. It has something to do with purpose. What is the thing's proper function? How does a tree function? How does it move sugar through its arteries to grow? How does photosynthesis work? So we look at the purpose of a tree to explain its existence, to explain its function. We can also have, this is a much trickier one, an interpretive explanation. Then we get into this field that's called hermeneutics, but don't worry about that term, in which we look at the meaning of something. Instead of looking at purpose or cause, we look more towards often language and the sense of the meaning as to why something is, trying to find an explanation. So that can get pretty tricky, and that's actually a large segment of the philosophy of science. Figuring out, well, we have an objective world, but we as humans are subjective creatures. How do we connect the two, the objective with the subjective, and understand it? Often that has to do with interpretation and doing the best interpretation possible, the best explanation possible that represents reality. But that's for a different conversation. Then there's the procedural. The procedural explanation looks at how something is done. How is the action carried out? Really straightforward. But under the umbrella of this much larger category, this thing that we're calling inference to the best explanation, we also find theoretical explanations. And that'll be the focus for our talk today. A theoretical explanation is part of an imagined world, and I don't use the word imagined as if to say that theories dictate or reveal fiction, lies. That's not what I mean. It's part of an imagined world in the sense that theoretical explanations go beyond what you have right in front of you, and they try and make sense of it. So what you have in front of you is complex, it's confusing, you only see parts of the overall puzzle, so you come up with this imagined reality that would explain what you see in front of you. The word theory doesn't mean fiction, it means the most plausible account. Hopefully a good account, but you have to go through a few steps to really know if the theory is plausible or not. So theoretical explanations are claims that say something is or is not the case. This is reality, but it just so happens that because reality is so complicated, you can't necessarily see it. So here's an example. In our aquarium, there are all kinds of elements, chemicals, molecules inside the water, and I can't see the different kinds of elements that are in the water. I just see the water. I have to test for things like phosphate and nitrate to know if there are too many things called nutrients in there because I'm overfeeding the fish. And when the phosphates and the nitrates go up too high, I will eventually get algae problems that sort of drown out the rest of the aquarium, which is not good. But I can't see any of these things happening unless I test. I have to use this testing equipment. Well, in the absence of testing equipment, maybe there's some part of reality that we're trying to figure out that we can't see. We don't have a specific number to put on it to say phosphate this, nitrogen, that kind of thing, nitrate that. So we have to postulate. That's what this theoretical modeling or thinking or hypothesis is about, postulating. Now the question is, does the theory match reality? How do we figure out if the theory matches reality? After all, there are a lot of theories floating around out there in the real world. Theories about election claims and vaccines, and global warming is one of the biggest ones right now, where there seems to be some conflict between the scientific consensus, the theory, often greenhouse gas theory, that's the title used, and the alternative, which is, well, you've heard of the alternatives. So which is correct? Is there such a thing as global warming, or isn't there? And why is it happening the way it is? We want explanations for this. And that has a huge impact on how we run society and how we live our lives, and whether or not the planet's even sustainable. So yeah, understanding inference, the best explanation, has very practical significance for us. So one more time, when I'm saying inference to the explanation, I'm doing something like this. I've noticed phenomena X, the lawnmower is broken. I find evidence or explanatory evidence for X. Maybe the dinosaur sat on it, a dinosaur sat on it. Therefore, because it's plausible to me, I can say that particular evidence is probably true. The dinosaur did sit on it. Now you're probably wondering, why would I postulate something as outrageous as a dinosaur sitting on a lawnmower? Well, that's part of the problem now, is that sometimes our theories have some pretty wild explanations built into them. And here's the thing. Sometimes even the most outrageous claims might turn out to be true if we follow the trail of evidence. In other words, we need to be careful about dismissing weird theories out of hand. Oh, a dinosaur clearly did not sit on my lawnmower. And frankly, to be honest, there's no dinosaur sitting on my lawnmower. But you get the idea. Sometimes these things pan out to be true. So how do we know? How do we begin to process these things? So I've come up with this wonderful theory that a dinosaur has been sitting on my lawnmower and ruining it. But now I need to be scientific about it, and I need to look for evidence. I need to test my theory. This begins with the assumption that not all theories or explanations, theoretical explanations, are built the same. They're not all equal. They need to be judged. And the history of science is full of examples of theories that were accepted for years that are one day overturned. You can look no further than Albert Einstein as an example of somebody who came into physics, saw how physics saw the world, and really fundamentally changed the trajectory of how people were thinking about reality. So his wild notions that have largely panned out to be testable and true evidence has appeared, was that odd theory out. That might not always be the case, of course, but again, we're reasoning beyond the evidence that we have in front of us, so there's a little bit of guesswork. It should be educated guesswork, and at the end of the day, this guesswork needs to be followed up with some rigorous thinking, testing, and hopefully evidence that everyone can agree to. So we want good evidence, so we can have good explanations. How do we get them? Well, let's start with, is my theory internally incoherent? Is there something about the internal consistency of my theory that makes it so full of contradictions that it couldn't possibly be true? So my theory is dinosaurs have been sitting on my lawnmower, or at least one. Is there something about my theory that seems internally inconsistent? Well, how about the fact that dinosaurs aren't living anymore? That would seem to frustrate the feasibility of my theory right off the top, so I may need to revise things substantially. That's internal consistency. The theory just doesn't seem to hold up in an obvious way. But external consistency, the observable data that I have is that this lawnmower won't start. Do I see dinosaur butt prints on my lawnmower? Do I see dinosaur footprints anywhere? Do I see dinosaurs at all? Just no. So internally, theory falls down. Externally, looking for observational data to fulfill it, none of it works. So right off the top, my theory can be set aside as something not very helpful. But what if I have something like the lawnmower is out of gas? Then we can probably proceed, because it's perfectly feasible that lawnmowers need gas, and if it's out of gas, I have a problem. And I can look and I can see observationally whether or not there's gas in it. So we're already on the right track. But there's more to the story. I remember the first time I heard about these criteria for thinking about scientific theories, and I thought, well, that's a lot of words for trying to make sense of something that is common sense. Much of this is common sense, right? But each of these actually supports or helps us support a very strong explanation or thinking about reality in a helpful way. So here they are. There are 5 of them: testability, fruitfulness, scope, simplicity, and conservatism. So testability, fruitfulness, scope, simplicity, conservatism. What are these things? None of these things are an absolute way of getting an absolute representation of reality. These are just very, very helpful strategies, methods, and processes for processing reality. And as you'll see, They're open to a certain amount of interpretation. Remember that word interpretation I gave before, where there's a sense of some people may weigh scope more than they might weigh fruitfulness, depending on the context. And that relies on the expertise of the people in the moment. Let's go through each of these. First is testability. If a theory isn't testable, it can't really be scientific in an obvious sense. A theory may be true, but if you can't test it, it becomes problematic. One of the famous examples of this is dark matter, dark energy, and dark flow. Some of these things seem to be testable, but things like dark matter that don't weigh anything, that you can't see, that you can't touch. A large part of the scientific community was just trying to figure out how can we find dark matter if our machines can't actually test for it. And that didn't stop them from trying to come up with machines that might test for it. Hopefully having a net, they could get some of these things, theoretically these things that still no one's seen, that would help explain the structure of reality. But if it's truly untestable, maybe I claim that there's a ghost in the room, but of course ghosts are supernatural, so science, as the study of the natural realm, would fall short. Science doesn't do supernature stuff or supernatural stuff. It does science, a physical world around us. So it's limited in that sense. Explanatory theories must be testable. If they're not testable, it's very hard to come up with an explanation. I mean, it's almost by definition. The second one is fruitfulness. Fruitfulness is about making novel predictions. A large part of this is a theory or an explanation is fruitful if it opens up new ways of seeing the world, new ways of researching or processing the world in a way that hadn't been done before. So think about a tree and it's growing new branches and then it grows new fruit. A field or a fruitfulness, a theory that's fruitful, provides new fruit that maybe we didn't have access to before. And the longer the tree is able to do that, the more reliable it's said to be. Again, it's not an absolute. It just says, okay, so here's a new way of seeing the world, a new way of processing information, and it seems to be helpful. It's working. So we say that this thing is fruitful. It takes time for something to be determined as fruitful. It takes scientific consensus, so other community members have to kind of agree, yes, this is helpful. But again, one more strategy. The next is scope. How well or how broad is this thing able to explain things? And is this theory able to explain things that it wasn't initially designed to explain? So let's say it turned out that my crazy theory about dinosaurs sitting on my lawnmower explained in a good way. Like I was actually able to find dinosaur footprints, and I was able to find the dinosaur butt print on my lawnmower or something like that. Does it also explain why some dinosaurs didn't go extinct? So I just wanted my theory to explain why my lawnmower was broken. But now the scope of my theory, that dinosaurs did it, are now helping to explain that there are actual dinosaurs living in the world. That's scope. That's a very interesting thing. And this happens, well, obviously with Einstein's theories. Many new fields of research were born because of that. The more a theory explains, the less likely it is to be false. The more a theory explains, the less likely it is to be false. The last two are simplicity and conservatism. Simplicity argues that the simpler the theory, typically, the better. This goes back to Occam's razor. Occam, famous philosopher and theologian, argued that we should not multiply entities unnecessarily. Don't overcomplicate life. Life is complicated enough. A simple theory isn't necessarily good because it's simple, because a simple theory may be overlooking the complexities of reality. But the simplest theory that works, the simplest theory that describes complex things, it may be itself complicated, but overly complicated theories tend to be faulty. So we want something simple. The lawnmower ran out of gas, man. Dinosaurs don't exist. Don't postulate dinosaurs. It's overcomplicating things. Go with the obvious explanation. The final one is conservatism. Conservatism argues that the best theory generally, not always, but generally, is one that fits with our established beliefs. Why? Well, we have years and years of scientific research and expertise that have gone into making sense of the speed of light, the nature of time, gravity, and so on. So when a theory comes along that doesn't match any of those, a couple of things will happen. First, just by law of averages, you could say it's probably not going to be true. because it's pushing against the weight of years and years of research. So probably not going to be true. It could be, but probably not. It certainly will undermine our knowledge, destabilize things a fair bit. If we're trying to rethink some basic assumptions that we already know to be true because we really want to keep this new theory, kind of reinventing the wheel when we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Now, what happens when these weird theories come along that are right, and our resistance to them, because they don't fit with our knowledge, they do destabilize previous understanding, they kind of make things messy, and we overlook them? Well, this is a big debate in science. How open are we to the reality around us? And how persistent are we in really staying with what we know to be true? So here's the basic logic. When you're thinking about scientific theories, generally speaking, we should stick with what we already know to be true, but be willing to change when we have good reasons for doing so. Not just fancy, whimsical. I would love if the dinosaurs were real, and they really were sitting on my lawnmower. But we can't run around thinking that radically. So this is the word conservatism again. We maintain what we know to be true until we have really strong evidence to change our position on something. That's prudent, practical, and just a good way forward for finding the best kind of explanation. So what do we have? We have this thing called testability that says you need to be able to test it, you need to be able to look for evidence, and if you can't really test it, you can't really have a scientific explanation per se. I.e. ghosts. How are you going to test for ghosts? That's a tough one. Fruitfulness, how's it doing with new research? Is it opening up new areas of research that were unexpected? Is it branching off like a tree with new fruit in new ways? Scope, is it able to explain a diversity of phenomena that was also maybe unexpected? The more it explains, the more likely it is to be true. Simplicity, are there some assumptions that don't really need to be made here? Is this overly complicated, convoluted? Certainly, if it's inconsistent, we have a problem. Conservativism. Does it fit with existing knowledge? It may expand new knowledge, but does it contradict current knowledge? If it contradicts current knowledge, then we have good grounds for rejecting it, unless some really strong reasons come across that, maybe we should entertain it. Testability, fruitfulness, scope, simplicity, and conservatism. Notice that none of these have a straightforward, this is how you ought to apply them. A leads to B leads to C. We're talking about human judgment in many of these cases. Again, some people may prize scope over simplicity. Some people may prize fruitfulness over conservatism, depending on the context. Hopefully, it's an educated judgment. Hopefully, it's something supported by the community. But all of this plays into this emerging picture of inductive reasoning, an inference to best explanation, theoretical hypotheses or theoretical explanations as the best we have in a very complex, very, very confusing world. Here's an example. It's kind of a scary example because this does happen, but a jetliner has crashed, and we're trying to figure out why. Again, inference to the best explanation. The investigators that go out and they look for black boxes and they look at the wreckage and they take pictures, they're all doing the basic thing. They may not be called scientists per se, they may be called investigators, but they're doing the same basic kind of thinking. And they're going to come up with a theory. They're going to come up with, this is the imagined story of what we think happened, and it will hopefully be supported by a lot of evidence. So let's go through some of the obvious ones. I'm sure you've seen this in the news. Claims of a terrorist missile, right? A solar flare. Maybe it disrupted the circuitry on the plane. A mechanical failure, right? Mechanical failures, these things happen all the time, specifically the fuel tank. It's like the lawnmower. I don't think there was a dinosaur with this one. Maybe a terrorist missile or a bomb. Maybe a bomb is slightly different. And we might even postulate, hey, you know what? It was aliens. Aliens did it. So we have 5 explanations now possible as to why it happened. So let's apply our criteria very simply and see which ones kind of come out on top. All right, so what can we say? Well, we can probably say that the idea that mechanical failure happened probably has the most scope, right? Mechanical failure, fuel tank leak, that just intuitively makes sense. And we're just doing common sense things right now, trying to apply this adequacy paradigm to our scenario. Aliens in a solar flare. Well, aliens in a solar flare don't really match up with the argument for simplicity, the fewest assumptions possible, because we would have to assume that aliens exist. And conservatism, which is, based on previous knowledge, how many planes have been brought down by solar flares? I don't know of any, but again, I'm not an expert in the field. So we could probably take out aliens and solar flares initially. What about the idea of a terrorist missile or a terrorist bomb? Those two seem to fail conservatism. We don't really have a lot of examples of those. Those don't happen very often. So what do we have? We have, at this point, things seem too complicated, too many assumptions. Aliens, solar flares. We don't have a lot of background examples of those things happening. Terrorist bomb or terrorist missile, not to say that these things don't happen. But what do we have a fairly broad example of? Mechanical failure. What do we hear about fairly often? Mechanical failure. And so when we're doing the inference of the best explanation in just that 30-second example, there's very strong grounds for accepting mechanical failure as the reason it crashed. Is it true? Well, we're going to have to go out, we're going to have to get evidence to support that theory. And if we find that there's shrapnel or pieces of a missile, if we find little creatures with green blood, then we'll realize our mechanical theory was incorrect. Now, if we go out and we find evidence that supports mechanical failure, and other scientists or investigators go out and they find, in the same context, evidence to support that theory, well, then after a while we can reasonably agree that that's probably what happened. That's it. That's science. Now, I've oversimplified it, of course, and I'm not talking about studies we do in a lab, multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar experiments even, and I'm not talking about how thousands and thousands of people do the same experiment or see the same thing and they make the same interpretation before they. We're just talking simply here. So what have we learned? We've learned that scientific theories are an imagined reality that will hopefully be borne out to be true, and we can see if they're true by finding the best possible explanation. We have some strategies. We have some methods for thinking through them. We have some sense of why inference is the best explanation, that the cornerstone of scientific reasoning at large. And we realize that science, and we in general, whether we're figuring out a lawnmower or figuring out why a plane fell or figuring out the structure of an atom, incrementally want better and better theories and explanations for things. And it's not just a once all and be all. For those who say, this has been proven, end of story, they've so often been shown to be incorrect that saying once and for all, this is the absolute truth, maybe oversteps the credibility of that kind of objective thinking. And what we need instead are persistent investigations that reveal the most plausible truth of the world around us.